For the first decade of the Cold War, the end of the world had a specific timeline. It was a mathematical assumption, a math of doom, that every general in the Pentagon and every marshal in the Kremlin knew by heart. The first fear was bombers. To spot them, the West built the Distant Early Warning Line, a 3,000-mile electronic fence across the Arctic Circle, buying hours of warning. But as the missile age dawned, that math shrank. The new northern vector, ICBMs coming over the pole, would be spotted by the Ballistic Missile Early Warning System, or BWIMS. The new working assumption? 30 minutes. Just enough time for Strategic Air Command to launch its bombers before their runways were vaporized. But in 1960, that math collapsed. The 30-minute safety margin was rendered obsolete by a new, terrifying calculus. A new weapon had emerged that did not come from the north. It did not show up on BWIM's radar. It came from the empty oceans, from the flanks. This weapon was the American Polaris submarine. It could park invisibly off the Soviet coast and incinerate Moscow in as little as 15 minutes. And in doing so, it introduced a new 15-minute apocalypse to the entire world, a terrifying new reality that Washington, D.C. itself would soon face once the Soviets inevitably built their own. It was one of the most complex machines ever built by man, a nuclear-powered underwater missile silo that could hide anywhere on Earth. It was an engineering marvel that forced the Soviet Union into a panic, leading them to build a fleet of radioactive coffins in a desperate attempt to catch up. This is the story of the 15-minute apocalypse. It is the story of how the U.S. Navy checkmated the Soviet Union with a weapon that was nearly impossible to find, couldn't be stopped, and, paradoxically, made the world safer by guaranteeing that no one could win a nuclear war. To understand the revolution of the submarine missile, one must first understand the strategic cognitive blind spot it exploited. In the 1950s, the entire Western defense apparatus was physically and psychologically oriented north. The United States had built a massive infrastructure to watch the Great Circle route. First, the DEW line for bombers, then the BMEWS system for missiles. These stations were the tripwire. If they detected Soviet ICBMs coming over the pole, they would flash a warning to the command bunkers in Nebraska. The system was designed to provide approximately 30 minutes of warning. This was the sufficient time, the absolute minimum for the Strategic Air Command to scramble its bomber fleet, getting them off the ground and on their way to fail-safe points before their bases were destroyed. But this entire system was based on a single assumption, that the attack would come from the north. It was a static defense against a static geography. The American Polaris program was about to prove that this map was wrong, not just for the Soviets, but eventually for the Americans too. A Polaris submarine could park invisibly off the coast. From these ideal hiding spots, it could launch a missile where, in some launch geometries, the flight time could be slashed to as little as 15 minutes. This reduced flight time created a new nightmare scenario, the Decapitation Strike. The 30-minute window of an ICBM attack was barely enough time for a leader to verify the warning, make a decision, and issue a launch order. But less than 15 minutes? 15 minutes is not enough time for a rational decision. It is barely enough time to wake the president. The goal of a decapitation strike is not to destroy the enemy's weapons, but to kill the leadership before they can even answer the red phone. The sheer terror of this possibility is proven by the shadowy Soviet response.
They eventually built Perimeter. Known in the West as the Dead Hand, its details remain murky, but its purpose was clear. A rumored fail-deadly system designed to automatically launch the Soviet nuclear arsenal if it detected a nuclear detonation and lost contact with the leadership. The mere concept of a doomsday machine was the ultimate validation of the 15-minute terror Polaris had introduced. This terror, however, was not symmetrical. The strategic balance of the submarine race was dictated by an unchangeable factor: geography. The United States is a maritime fortress with unfettered access to the deep waters of the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. The Soviet Union, by contrast, is geologically cursed. The Soviet Northern Fleet, based on the Kola Peninsula, was bottled up. To reach the open Atlantic, Soviet submarines had to pass through the GIUK Gap, the choke point between Greenland, Iceland, and the United Kingdom. NATO invested heavily in closing this gap. The seabed was increasingly lined with SOS-US hydrophone arrays, and the surface was patrolled by anti-submarine aircraft. Any Soviet submarine attempting to transit had to run a gauntlet of sensors. This immense anti-submarine warfare pressure, combined with the threat of Polaris, forced the Soviet Navy to evolve. They gradually adopted a defensive bastion strategy, keeping their missile submarines close to home in the Barents Sea, protected by their own fleet. The Polaris submarine, simply by being American, won a geographic victory. It could roam. The Soviets were forced to hide.
The Polaris system was not just a weapon, it was a strategic cheat code. Its success was built on a trifecta of revolutionary concepts: a powerful strategic doctrine, a game-changing technology, and a masterful political defense. The fundamental weakness of bombers and land-based missiles is that they are visible. They sit on runways and in silos. This makes them use them or lose them assets. In a crisis, if you think the enemy is attacking, you must launch immediately or risk being disarmed. This hair-trigger pressure is the most dangerous element of nuclear strategy. The Polaris submarine solved this. By hiding at sea, it became the most survivable leg of the nuclear triad. It was the ultimate ace card, a guaranteed second strike. The mission was simple: survive the apocalypse and then avenge it. Because the Polaris fleet could not be reliably destroyed in a first strike, it guaranteed that any attack on the United States would result in the total obliteration of the attacker. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara authorized a massive force of 41 ballistic missile submarines, the 41 for Freedom. These boats stabilized the Cold War. Because they were safe, the president did not have to rush. He could wait. He could ride out an attack, verify it, and then decide to retaliate. The survivability of Polaris provided the one thing no other system could: time. The first Polaris missile, the A-1, was a blunt instrument. It was incredibly inaccurate, with a circular error probable of over 2 miles. You couldn't use it to snipe a missile silo or a hardened bunker. But this inaccuracy did not save the enemy leadership. The Polaris was a counter-value weapon, a city killer. Even if the missile missed the president's bunker by a mile, the 600-kiloton W-47 warhead would vaporize the city above him. It didn't need to hit the bunker directly to succeed in a decapitation strike. By erasing the capital, it severed the nervous system of the state. The leadership might survive the blast in a hole in the ground, but with the antennas melted and the city gone, no orders could get out. The head was cut off from the body. This defined Polaris as a counter-value weapon, a city killer.
Its job was not to fight a war, but to end a civilization. But the true engineering triumph wasn't the warhead, it was the fuel. The Navy had learned from the Army's mistakes. They knew that handling liquid rocket fuel inside a submarine was suicidal. Liquid fuels are volatile, toxic, and require complex plumbing. So the Special Projects Office bet everything on solid fuel. Using advanced designs like the internal burning star grain, they created a solid fuel motor that was cast as a single rubbery block. It was inert, shockproof, and stable. It could sit in a launch tube for months and ignite instantly. This was the cheat code. Solid fuel meant safety, no toxic leaks. It meant readiness, instant launch. And it meant stealth. No noisy pumps or valves to give away the submarine's position. The mastery of solid fuel was the single greatest technological gap between the US and the USSR. But one of the greatest tricks of the Polaris program was not just engineering, it was bureaucracy. In the 1950s, the US Air Force wanted to kill the Navy's missile program. They saw strategic nuclear weapons as their exclusive turf. To protect his program, Admiral Red Rayborn championed a new management system called PERT, Program Evaluation and Review Technique. Historians still debate its true impact. It was both a genuine coordination tool for a massive project and a brilliant bureaucratic shield. PERT was used to manage the external environment. The colorful, computerized PERT charts impressed Congress and terrified the auditors, making the program look hyper-efficient and untouchable. By appearing to have a hyper-scientific management system, Rayborn bought his engineers the funding and political freedom they needed to solve the real problems.
While the U.S. was perfecting its apex engineering, the Kremlin was in a state of panic. They were defenseless against the 15-minute weapon. Their response was a panic-building program that prioritized speed over safety, leading to 2 generations of submarines that were essentially floating radioactive coffins. The Soviets' first attempt was the Hotel-class. It was a rush job hybrid, a Frankenstein's monster that welded missile tubes into an existing attack submarine hull, but its fatal flaw was the launch system. The Hotel-class had to surface to fire its missiles. It took 12 minutes on the surface to launch its payload. In the age of radar and satellite surveillance, a surfaced submarine is a dead submarine. This weapon was a tactical farce, a Potemkin deterrent built for propaganda, not war. The flagship of this panic was the K-19, known to its crew as Hiroshima. It was cursed from the start. In the rush to meet the deadline, the shipyard had deliberately cut corners. A critical backup cooling system for the nuclear reactor was simply not installed. On its maiden voyage in 1961, the reactor coolant failed. Without the backup system, the core began to melt down. To save the ship, the crew had to jury-rig a cooling pipe, entering the high-radiation reactor chamber with no protection. They sacrificed their lives to stop a thermal explosion. While precise casualty figures vary, sources agree that around 8 men died in agony within days from acute radiation sickness, and many more followed. The K-19 was a victim of the Kremlin's schedule. The panic of the 1960s didn't just kill sailors then, it left a legacy curse that lasted for decades. The next generation, the Yankee-class, looked like a Polaris clone on the outside, but inside it carried a hidden fatal flaw: liquid fuel. The Soviets still hadn't mastered solid propellants. They were forced to use storable liquid fuels, a toxic cocktail of UDMH and nitrogen tetroxide. These chemicals are devil's venom. They are hypergolic,
They explode on contact. Even as late as the 1980s, Soviet subs were still sailing with this volatile risk. On October 3, 1986, 26 years after the Polaris panic began, the bill came due. The Yankee-class sub K-219 suffered a seal failure near Bermuda. The seawater mixed with the liquid fuel, causing a massive chemical explosion that blew the missile out of the tube and ruptured the hull. The K-219 sank. The disaster proved that the Soviets' original panic-building decisions in the 60s had created a fleet that remained dangerous to its own crews as it was to the Americans. The K-219 accident was chemically impossible on a U.S. Polaris boat.
The central paradox is this: how did a weapon that slashed warning times make the world safer? The answer is mutually assured destruction. Because the Polaris fleet was so survivable, it removed the incentive for a first strike. The Soviets knew that no matter what they did, the 41 for freedom were out there, hidden in the deep. A surprise attack was suicide. This certainty stabilized the balance of terror. Polaris became the currency of Western power. When the U.S. canceled the Skybolt missile in 1962, it nearly toppled the British government. President Kennedy saved the alliance by selling Polaris to the UK. The Nassau Agreement transferred Britain's entire nuclear deterrent from the Royal Air Force to the Royal Navy. It bound the UK's nuclear fate to American technology, a bond that exists to this day with the Trident missile. The Polaris missile never really went away. It evolved. From Polaris came Poseidon. From Poseidon came Trident. The modern Trident II D5 missile is the direct descendant. But this evolution has created a final, unsettling debate. The original Polaris was a city killer, too inaccurate for a first strike. The modern Trident is a silo killer, so accurate it can destroy hardened targets. This has led some strategists to ask if we have come full circle. Has the technology become too good? A weapon that is both survivable and accurate enough for a first strike raises new, troubling questions about the temptation of a decapitation strike. The Polaris program solved the vulnerability of the 1950s, but in its quest for perfection, it may be challenging the very safety paradox it created. The 15-minute apocalypse is still out there, patrolling the deep, quieter, and deadlier than ever before.